everyone. Thanks for coming to our EDS seminar this week. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Hannah Haney. Hannah and I have been friends for several years now, and because we worked on a working group together. So those of you who are a part of ESOL know that lots of ESOL's output is based on these working groups that form, and then we're hoping that those go for a really long time. There was an evolutionary synthesis center 10 years ago. One of the working groups that came out of that evolutionary synthesis group is now living on, and we both got invited to join this thing later on when we were postdocs after we'd been going for a couple of years. And now Hannah is still involved in a lot of those groups. She is in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Colorado, but she comes by way of geography. So she did her undergraduate at Dartmouth in geography, then moved to Berkeley to start a linguistics career as a grad student. Did her first postdoc at Yale. This is when I met her, when she joined our group. And then after that, did another postdoc at CSU with one of the working group members. So I think you're going to see this really, really cool thread between geography and linguistics that you've probably never seen before, and see this model of one of these working groups being really, really successful for like multiple decades after it formed out of a really cool initial idea. So please join me in welcoming Hannah. Hey, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah. And thanks everybody for coming to meet with me today. I am going to borrow from Ty. I did a great job of setting the stage of the ESOL Clinic by talking about kitchens and talking about the various kitchens that people work in and how you might have a food truck and you might have a big commercial kitchen. And I'm going to invite you into my kitchen today to tell you a little bit about what sort of ingredients I work with, what I cook, maybe let you taste a few things, and then talk about how to cook better together. So if you have ever been to my house, you would know that I have a very retro old kitchen. My kitchen has pink countertops, and I keep them. I like them. But I'm updating my kitchen, and I'm taking the good that has come out of this really traditional old school stuff, and I am making it better, more functional for myself. I'm cooking with different ingredients than the original householders probably cooked with, and I'm doing different things in that kitchen, which is sort of how I feel about linguistics. I'm a linguist, and I'm taking what's good about linguistics, some of the innovations that linguistics brings to the table, but then I'm also bringing in other ingredients, other types of data, other tool sets, modernizing things, and trying to move linguistics forward in interesting new directions. So welcome to my kitchen. Okay, so just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. I want to start by talking about the data that I work with. And these are, in the kitchen analogy, right? These are my ingredients. Linguistic and cultural data might be things you haven't thought about if you work in more earth and environmental science. So I just want to talk a little bit about what it is that we bring in from linguistics and from social sciences more generally to look at systems that involve language, culture, and the environment. And then I want to talk about how we can use linguistic data in concert with cultural and environmental data to answer questions about systems that are sort of uniquely formed around the confluence of social, linguistic, and ecological processes and factors. And finally, I want to hopefully open the floor and chat with you about opportunities that might exist to enhance our picture of the past, which is a lot of what I work on, is thinking about the past and how things have gotten to be the way they are now. And also to think about how we might incorporate things like linguistic and cultural data into projections for the future, or making things better for real humans in the real world in the future. So to start, let's just talk about linguistic data. You probably are familiar with linguistic data because every time we interact as humans, we use linguistic data, we create linguistic data. So if you have edited a Wikipedia article, if you have written a book chapter or a book or a journal article or even a newspaper article, you created some linguistic data. If you have interacted casually with other people, especially if you've done that in a place where those interactions are recorded, for example, in an online space, you created linguistic data. Now, there are algorithms out there that you're probably familiar with, big AI models that take all this big data, and they put it together in a sort of black boxy way. Here I've got a meat grinder just to try to bring the kitchen analogy into it, right? But it takes all this data that's really diverse, right? There's a lot of different types of data. There's all sorts of stuff going into this, and generates things like AI language models. You're probably familiar with ChatGPT. It's been in the news and talked about on a campus like this a lot lately. So that's what you can do with big data. But that isn't always the right way to answer questions involving language and the environment. And there are a lot of reasons for that. So for example, this might be really abundant abundant data, but it's only abundant for a small number of languages. If you're working on English, this is great. If you're working on a community or a place where English isn't the language, this isn't going to be very useful to you. So there's some limitations here. It's not available for most languages. You can't control the content that's here. So if you want to know about something really specific, this might not have that information in its training data, or it might have bad information in its training data. So, you know, relying on this for answering questions can be a little bit difficult. This sort of big data is computationally intensive to process, which, you know, we're getting better and better at doing that. But it's not always transparent how it's used in these language models. Nevertheless, people do use big data to answer questions about language and the environment. For example, last year, one of my students looked at Twitter data to ask what factors influence the emergence of environmental disastonyms, how we name fires and floods and hurricanes and things like that, and how this spreads through communities and how people convert on what the real name is and how people's relationships to the environment impact that convergence on disastonyms. So you can actually use big data to answer some questions. You just have to be careful about how you do it. What we end up relying on then to kind of overcome some of these drawbacks of big data in language and linguistics are what I would call big-ish data or big enough data. And these are moderately sized data sets that can amass relatively large quantities of information for large samples of languages and cultures. These are usually things where we try to make large amounts of data available for much of the world, for many languages or many cultures. In linguistics, this might look like the GramBank data set. So this is a data set that I worked on that captures information about grammars of the world's languages. And it was released just this spring. So this is a kind of new, big, fun tool to play with. And here is a map of the different languages. There's about 2,500 languages on this map that we have information about what's the order of the subject and the verb. If there's no object in a sentence, does the subject come first or does it come after the verb? And so you can see green is subject first, blue is subject last, orange means both are possible. And there are 195 features in this data set. So for linguistics, that's actually kind of big. For a lot of other fields, this would not be a very big data set, but for linguistics, this is big-ish. In culture, this might look like the dplace database, which brings together information about languages, culture, and the environment all in one big database. And the cultural variables come from ethnographies and various cross-cultural ethnographic data sets that have been created by prior scholars. So here we have information about what a society's primary mode of subsistence is. And color scheme is not one I chose, but white, gray, and yellow are kind of hunting, gathering, fishing. Orange, purple, green, orange, blue, and red are agricultural societies. So you can see that there are patterns in the diversity of this particular cultural variable around the world. These sorts of data also have their pros and cons. It's expensive to put together a data set like this. GramBank has taken, I don't know, 10 years, something on that scale. And there's over 100 people who've been involved in the creation of this data set. It's a big undertaking. On the other hand, and there's kind of a limit in the scope of how many things you can encode, right? If it's expensive to produce the data, then you can't just get everything that's out there. You have to pick and choose what you want to encode. On the other hand, this can be really useful because you can get high quality data. The data is really transparent. It hasn't been processed through things like neural networks that kind of obscure some of what's being encoded in your data set. It's possible to have good metadata and documentation of the processes that were used to create the data. And you can really dig in and try to understand what's happening in data sets like this. I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, lastly, the spices in my spice cabinet are little small data sets. And these are sometimes really necessary to answer specific questions. For example, on the left is a table that shows for a few societies what sort of land ownership norms exist. Is land owned by kin, which is a K in this data set? Is it owned by nobody, N? Is it owned by groups of people that aren't related to one another through any sort of kinship relationships? Or is it owned by individuals? That is difficult information to gather. It takes a lot of thinking about how people relate to the land. And so it's too difficult to do this for all of the societies of the world. You might end up with a small curated data set that encodes just one variable like this for some set of sampled societies or ethno-linguistic groups that you care about. On the right is what linguistic data looks like in this sort of small curated data set world. This is a set of suffixes and how they're pronounced by individual speakers of a language called Mono that's spoken in the Sierra Nevada and Owens Valley area of California and Nevada. So this information is useful if you want to study microscale language variation. You'll see these data again, or you'll see the outputs of these data in a moment. So these are useful, but they have their cons too, right? Again, it's also expensive to collect these data, and they're often kept in small researcher data hoards instead of being open and accessible. And they're typically collected by people who may not have thought about interoperability and metadata. So these are, the spices you have to use with caution. And when you develop them yourself, you have to think carefully about what you're going to do with them and how you're going to make them available. So this is what the data looks like in linguistics. It's probably a bit different than what you work with. A lot of it is categorical instead of quantitative. A lot of it involves smaller data sets or mixtures of everything from very large to very small data sets. There are a few things we have to do to use this well. The first thing is understanding our data. And we can use the data itself to understand our data. In this linguistic and cultural data, a lot of the data we have is sort of opportunistically collected. Somebody has gone out and studied a culture or a language, and they've written about it, they've documented, they've put something out there in the world that we can think about, we can understand, we can extract information from. But that often introduces biases. There are biases in terms of the research efforts that have been paid in different areas or to different topics. There are biases in the different perspectives that have been reflected over time in different academic traditions. And when we look at linguistic data, so this is going back to that Gram Bank data set of grammatical information about the world's languages. If we look at those grammars of the world's languages, we have biases regarding what languages have received research attention. We have biases regarding what eras different things were being done in, and how the traditions in the sort of theoretical world of linguistics impact how languages are described. But we also have biases just in terms of what parts of grammar are consistently well described and what parts aren't well described. So for example, here you can see that negation, how you make a sentence negative, right? I didn't do that, is something that's typically relatively well described. These distributions reflect the sort of level of description of this across all of the world's languages in the existing documentary materials. It's easy to find information about negation. You're less likely to find information for a language of the world about comparison. So if I want to say my brother is taller than me, that sort of comparison of individuals or properties is something that isn't typically very well described. You might not find information about it. But to really understand what's happening in our data, we have to not only understand these sorts of biases, this is just one example of that, but also where things get a little bit noisy. And so using the data that goes with our data set, we have notes from our annotators. And this language data that's created by people who are coding language data, right? They're coding language data. They're putting notes about how they arrived at a decision about how to code something, or what sort of uncertainty they have. We can do some processing of that language data and quantify how straightforward it is to code different elements of grammar into sort of categorical variables. And you'll notice that the things that are easy and hard, or the things that are more or less straightforward, are different than what has a lot of information. So something can be minimally described or not often described, but when it is described, it can be really straightforward to code. For example, classification, which is things like in a language that has something like gender, is something masculine or feminine? Or if you're in a language that has a larger number of noun classes, is it masculine, feminine, human, plant? Right? This can be different types of classification that maybe we in this term are very familiar with. But when this exists, it's usually relatively straightforward to categorize what's happening in that grammar. On the other hand, when we have things like derivation, how we form new words. If you want to verb a noun in English, you don't do much to it, right? You just add the verbal morphology that we would normally use, which isn't very much, and you can use a noun as a verb. But other languages do this differently, and that tends to not be very well described, the sorts of new word formation processes. Now, this sort of using data to understand data helps us to know where our blind spots are, where our biases are, and what we're uncertain about, or where we should expect noise in data as we analyze it. So once we have our data and we have understood our data sets and kind of understand how these social science data sets, what the limitations are, and what the things we need to consider as we use them in analyses are. Then we need to link data sets together. And in the sort of work I do, where I link linguistics to culture, to the environment, this is not a trivial task. And there are some resources that exist for this, and languages themselves have typically been used as the primary link to bring this all together, to bring culture, language, and environment together. If you can identify something to a particular language, then you can often link it to a place. And that sort of helps this all bring everything together. There are identifiers that exist. So are you guys familiar with ISO codes in general for sort of standard identifiers for various types of information? One of those is ISO 6393, and that describes languages. It's basically a list of languages, and for every language of the world, there's a 3-letter code. But it's not so straightforward. What is a language? What is a dialect? What's the difference between languages and dialects? This is actually really hard and controversial, and it's not easy to get right. The organization that currently that has the authority to register language ISO codes is an organization called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and they are a missionary organization. They are not immune to the sort of biases that most organizations have, and so they're designing these systems for describing languages for their particular purposes. That doesn't mean that they think of the difference between languages and dialects the same way that a different linguist might. So this set is not used by everybody, and there's another set of identifiers that have been developed that link to ISO codes, but they have a more elaborate set of language identifiers that involve 4 letters and 4 digits that captures what they call a language or doculect. So instead of saying, this is a language, I know this is a language, I'm just going to use my authority to say that this is a language. They capture things that have been documented in the world. So maybe somebody went to a particular place at a particular time and they documented some form of language, which in linguistics we call a lect. If we're being sort of agnostic about whether it's a language or a dialect, we might call it just a lect. And so these lects are captured, and they're provided identifiers that can be linked to those ISO codes, but they also involve a little bit more granularity, and they enable more discussion about what is a separate language and what is a dialect of another language. So these are really useful. These glottolog identifiers in particular are really useful for understanding languages, understanding relationships between languages, and also linking languages to cultural data. And I'll talk about environmental data in a moment. But these are imperfect, right? Because languages and cultures don't match one-to-one. So even if you choose the best system here and you have identifiers that you think are pretty good at describing languages, languages and cultures aren't the same thing. So you have to be really careful when you're linking things together. And it helps to involve people who are familiar, ideally people from the communities related to these languages and cultures when you're doing this linking. Sometimes you just have to do your best, to match things or match at a higher level and understand that there's some uncertainty in your matching. Okay, so that links language and culture, right? If you can identify the language that's associated with a group, then you can link it to a language identifier. And those language identifiers are linked to space. So in the ethnologue version of this sort of catalog of languages are linked to polygons. Now, these polygons were developed for missionary purposes. So they capture where a language is spoken right now. If you want to go there and translate a Bible, where are you going to find the speakers of these languages? Well, if you want to contact a speaker of Seneca right now, you might find them in Oklahoma, in this tiny little polygon they've drawn in Oklahoma. But if you want to ask a question about where Seneca was spoken and how it might have co-evolved with the environment it was spoken in, Oklahoma is not going to be very useful to you. So there are problems with how these are linked to the land. There are also problems in that this centers a particular perspective on language and on human relationships with the land, a kind of colonial perspective. And there are problems with privileging the sort of information that's on this sort of map. The other alternative that's been implemented, like glottolog, that other resource for the identifiers that I showed you, is to use point data to say, I don't want to get involved in anything that could disadvantage people in terms of land claims and things like that. So I'm not going to draw polygons on a map. I'm not going to try to state where some language's territory was, because that has real impacts on human beings who have relationships with land. So I'm going to put points on a map and be agnostic about where around that point the language is spoken. But this also has disadvantages. So if you have a very small language range and a very large language range, your language is spoken in a relatively small area might be better represented by the environmental data associated with that point than a language that ranges over a really big, diverse geographic territory. So there's a lot to think about in this, and I will add one more wrinkle to how difficult it is to link these data sets together, and that is time. So I kind of mentioned it when I talked about the polygon representation. This represents where languages are spoken now, which is mostly on reservations in Oklahoma, right, in this particular map. But if you want to ask a question that relates to a different slice of history, then you need to link to the land at an appropriate time. Where were these languages and cultures at the relevant time? And that adds another layer of complexity to all this. At the end of the day, you can use these things to link culture and language to land and environment, but they're imperfect. And you may end up having to do a lot of data cleanup and a lot of your own research to try to do better at linking these. So that's my little caution about how hard it is just to get the data together. So it's like growing the garden instead of just buying ingredients at the store in your kitchen. But it's doable. And once we have data together, we can answer some questions. So what sort of questions do I ask and answer? Well, I think it's really important to think about these sort of systems that link language, culture, and the environment as operating on different scales. And that's something that linguistics doesn't often think about. And so I find it really interesting to ask about how does language diversity and cultural diversity interact with the environments in which it evolves at different scales. So thinking about a really big time scale, we might ask, how are languages distributed around the world, right? Language has existed for thousands of years. And even if you look at a continent like North America that was relatively recently settled, languages have been here for, many thousands of years. On that time scale, languages have traveled. People have traveled and they brought languages across this continent, throughout the continent, and they have diversified in these environments. So why are languages distributed so unevenly? Do people not just spread out and find a place and sit down and stay there, and then another, a similar territory gets occupied by another group of people? Every time a group splits off, why doesn't it just occupy the same sort of space and speak languages over the same sorts of territories? There's a lot of mechanisms and explanatory factors that have been proposed. For example, you might think that this is about carrying capacity and group size limits, human social organization, and the limits that imposes on how big a group can be. Which might interact with things like carrying capacity to influence things like the splitting of groups or the contact between groups and what happens when groups are in conflict, or things like perturbations from unpredictable socio-political or ecological events. We can model all this. If we think that there are processes at play, we can forward model them and make predictions about what sort of diversity patterns we might find and test whether these mechanisms do a good job of predicting the sort of diversity that we can observe. But we can also examine specific hypotheses about the environmental factors that are important to language diversity. And people have a lot of ideas about this, right? Some people think that it's all about rivers or mountains, right? Barriers and conduits to contact, or that it's all about the environment and the carrying capacity and group size, like as I mentioned just a moment ago. There are a whole bunch of different ideas about this. And a group that I've been involved in has used geographically weighted path models to allow us to examine the relative contributions of these potential predictors, while understanding that these explanatory variables are interrelated among themselves. They are not independent of one another, and simultaneously allowing these to vary over space. When you do that, you can do a reasonably good job of predicting linguistic diversity better in some areas than others, right? We're over predicting how diverse some parts of North America would be. We're under predicting other areas. But one of the important things we find is that the thing that best predicts linguistic diversity is different in different parts of a continent. That it's not stationary, that geographically there's some differences in what is the most important explanatory factor in explaining linguistic diversity. So there's some important lessons to be learned here about, thinking about linguistic diversity and what happens locally. And we can also model it on a more global scale and, see how well just implementing these sort of mechanisms does for predicting what we might find in terms of linguistic diversity. If you want to know more, here's a paper you can check out. On a somewhat smaller scale, on the cultural side of things, one of the cultural practices that is central to human environment relations is land tenure. Land tenure systems. Okay, I won't touch the cord. Land tenure systems are systems of ownership and usufruct, right? Using and owning land that are important for how humans develop their cultures, right? Are you going to farm that land? Are you going to hunt on land? Does it matter who owns that land for those practices? Or is it going to be inherited by your children or certain children or by other groups? But it also can shape the environment itself. Owning land or using land, we see what happens in terms of the management of that land. And humans have impacts on those environments. This is one of the mediating factors. So because land tenure is so central as a cultural practice to the links between social customs and, ecological conditions, there are a lot of theories about what shapes it. Some of these take evolutionary forms. So people have said that humans progress towards ever more individualistic rights. And so you expect land ownership to move from more communal forms to more individualistic forms. People have also said that humans develop land ownership as part of their defense of resources. So when you need to defend resources, say if they are scarce or unreliable or they're threatened, or maybe if they're very rich, right? If you found a really good source of something, you might want to defend it. It might be that when you are in competition for resources, when you have neighbors who want the same resources, you develop ownership to protect those resources. Others have even said that it depends primarily on agricultural development. If you're not farming the land or maybe building irrigation systems, maybe you don't need to protect that land. Maybe you don't need to own it. So there's a lot of theory out there. And we can look at this in a couple of ways. Languages are useful for creating family trees. We can apply evolutionary methods to language just like we do to biological species to create phylogenies. And on those phylogenies, we can trace the probable evolutionary trajectories of characteristics like land ownership systems. So if people have said that land ownership systems get ever more individualistic, what we've found when we actually model the evolution of land tenure systems on ethno-linguistic family trees is that that's not the case. The best models, the top three models here, top three models here, which are the ones that are reasonable based on AIC, that these models don't involve a constant movement towards more individualistic ownership rights. In fact, the model that best captures that constant march towards individual rights, that is actually the second worst model in this set of models that we considered, that we tried fitting to this family tree. So we can weigh in on these ideas about these ideas that have sort of been developed but not very well tested about what determines these systems that link humans to their environment. And we can also explicitly test specific predictors. In the models that we ran, where we did sort of multi-model averaging, we found that the most important predictor was what your neighbors are doing. If your neighbors own land, you're more likely to own land. It doesn't matter as much, whether you are in a mountainous, patchy resource area or whether you have agriculture. It might matter a little bit whether your resources are unpredictable, but mostly it's about what your neighbors are doing. That contradicts a lot of theory that's been proposed out there to explain this. And bringing together all these data sources is the only way to really work on that while taking into account things like Galton's problem. The fact that these languages and cultures are evolving together and that sister languages and cultures are more likely to be more similar to inherit things from a common ancestor. If you want to know more, there's a paper out there. Finally, I want to talk about an even smaller scale. And this is one that I'm really interested in. When we think about language diversity, we often think about how many languages are there in a particular area. It's a very basic concept of it. But you can also think about how differently are people speaking in different places. If you're from Colorado and you go somewhere in the South, you're going to notice that people speak a little differently there than they do here. And if you go to another part of the English-speaking world, you're going to notice even bigger differences. This has been really well studied in Europe. And some of the models that exist are things like a gravity model that basically says the larger a community is and the closer you are to that community, the more features of their speech you should adopt, the more similar your speech will be. And conversely, the more distant or the smaller that community is, the less likely you are to adopt speech features from that community. This works really well in a place like the Netherlands, where you have cities and towns that have been there for a long time, that have been interacting in pretty consistent ways, right? Where you have cities and hinterlands, and people have social organizations that bring people together in urban areas. How does this work if you're living in a place like this, right? It's not the Netherlands. It's not a big plain of agricultural land. It's a pretty interesting terrain. And if you're in a place like this and you don't have an industrialized society with much hierarchical organization to your political systems or to your social systems, if you are not organized the way a European community is, how well do these models fit? Do they predict the differences between how individuals speak on the sort of dialect scale? And maybe instead of just looking at distance and the size of a city, you want to look at things like where small communities were, all of the small communities, and what sort of trails or links there are between those communities that might be more useful in a place like Sierra Nevada of California than just point to point as the crow flies distance. You also might want to consider things like resource areas. Why did people come together? When did people come together? How often did people come together? The gravity model might not be the model to apply here. So now the challenge for the future is to think about how diversity develops in societies, how linguistic diversity develops in societies that are different than the ones that we have based our theories on so far. There's a lot of work still to be done in this area. For now, I've got a book chapter coming out soon that talks a little bit about how the old theories aren't quite the right tool for understanding this. So I want to wrap up here by talking about some opportunities that might exist to do good interdisciplinary research and to keep retrofitting that kitchen, right? To keep bringing in new ingredients, new data sets, new ideas, and new tools to get better insights about the past and also potentially about the present and the future. So one of the questions that's been asked in linguistics, one of the classic questions is, where was the ancestral language of a language family spoken and when? That's a question linguists like to ask. What was the Urheimat, the homeland of a language family? And one of the languages that plays a role in this is the Uto-Aztecan language family, which was spoken here in Colorado, in southern Colorado, but also spanning all the way over to California and Oregon and down through central Mexico. This is a massive language family in terms of its geography and also historically in terms of its speaker population. There's theory out there that says that language families should only get so big geographically and in terms of their speaker populations if they spread as a consequence of the spread of agriculture. People get agriculture, they're able to, they've got some abundant resources now, they're able to stockpile food for times of famine, they're able to grow their populations, they're able to specialize their economies, they get more population, there's population pressure, and they expand. And they take their agriculture with them, and thus they take their language with them, and languages move through agriculture. That's how you get these big language families that spread through massive territories. Uto-Aztecan is the language family that people point to in North America as an example of this. The idea is that this has happened everywhere that agriculture has independently evolved. But that doesn't jive with some of the linguistic data. Linguists have said, actually, we think that instead of Uto-Aztecan starting as a language, a proto-language in Mexico with agriculture and then spreading north, we actually think there's some evidence that the Yudostecans started somewhere in the north. And they were using local resources without agricultural cultivation. And then they spread south. It's a big controversy. And when you have language to build family trees with, when you have cultural data about agriculture, which is represented by these colorful bars here, which I will talk about in just a moment. And when you have information about geography and the environment, you can bring these all together and do things like we have done here. So we've inferred a family tree of Yudo-Aztecan, which answers some of the linguistic questions here. If languages just get agriculture and then move apart really fast, they should have rake-like phylogenies with lots of fast branching. And we don't really find that here. We could also ask, where were people? And so we did a phylogeographic analysis to try to simultaneously infer where the nodes of the trees were, as we're inferring what languages or clades are linked together at those nodes. So here we have hypotheses represented by dotted lines. There's a, I don't know if you can see the green dotted line at the top, and then a red dotted line in the middle of this map. And then down in Mexico, there's a blue dotted line. These represent 3 prominent hypotheses about where Proto-Yudo-Aztecan was spoken. Now, the one that's farthest south in central Mexico, that's the idea that this was an agriculturalist community that spread northward. They started in Mexico. When we plot the posterior distribution of probable homelands for Yudo-Aztecan, for Proto-Yudo-Aztecan, the yellow and red shows that probability distribution. Red is the highly probable places, yellow is somewhat less probable, but still in the distribution. And you can see that we're predicting that Proto-Yudo-Aztecan was spoken somewhere maybe in southern interior California, Arizona border area. That fits with one of these hypotheses that exists. So we have some evidence here that maybe this one hypothesis is a little bit more, it fits better with the data. Finally, we can take that cultural data that's on the tree here that's a little hard to see, right? But if you look at this top violin plot, this shows in the tan the likelihood of not having agriculture, essentially, and the likelihood of having agriculture is in the red, in that top row of plots. You can see that these aren't even close, right? That these violin plots don't look like violins, they look like weird smushed vases. And there's a high probability of Yudo-Aztecan not having agriculture. And the northern Yudo-Aztecan branch, the 2 primary branches are northern and southern, also probably didn't have agriculture, whereas by the time people moved south, they might have obtained agriculture. So we have some cultural evidence that this probably wasn't an agricultural spread, but rather that agriculture happened in one of the clades, the sub-branches of this language family after it split apart. But there's a lot more we could ask about this. For example, when people try to explain the various alternative scenarios, the 3 dotted line areas on this map and the histories people propose to explain why people would have started in these places and moved where they did. There's a lot of appeal to environmental and climate facts. Climate changes that have happened and how that impacted local environments where people were living and speaking these languages, and what that meant for their subsistence patterns and their use of local natural resources. But we haven't integrated that here yet. So I think there's an opportunity to do work like this that better integrates information about the climate and the environments in which these human processes have happened. I showed you a data set that captured linguistic diversity in more dimensions than it's been captured in before. So we typically talk about languages per area as this basic measure of linguistic diversity. But anybody who works on biological diversity knows that it's not just about like plotting how many different species of a particular, of a particular type of animal or plant there are in a particular area, that there's a lot more to diversity than just one dimension. And with the publication of this GramBank data set, we've actually teased apart some dimensions of variation in grammar. In other words, the functional diversity of languages is becoming more apparent, and we're learning more about that. So here on this map, instead of just putting a random set of colors to show you different languages on the map, as I think was shown on one of the other maps I showed you, here we have an RGB space that's mapped onto the first 3 components in the principal component analysis on 195 grammatical features. So we found the independent dimensions of variation in this big or big-ish or big enough grammatical data set. And we use those to create a color space. So things that are more similar in color here are more similar grammatically. Languages that are kind of light teal, as in Southern Africa, are more similar to one another, and they're pretty different from the pink languages you find on the Pacific coast of South America. These vary in 3 dimensions, but there are actually a lot more dimensions of variation that come out of this PCA. You need a lot of different independent variables to capture linguistic diversity. Nevertheless, we know more about the sort of design space of language and the functional diversity of languages than we ever have before. And we can think about this in terms of how different language families here, each color represents a different language family, and they're sort of plotted in the first 2 dimensions of this PCA. We can look at how different language families occupy different areas of this design space of language. We can look at what areas aren't occupied at all by any languages and think about that from a linguistics lens about why that might be. And we can also think about what we stand to lose in terms of our understanding of this full design space of language as languages are under pressure, right? As they are lost through endangerment processes. So here, the green convex holes show the current occupied sort of design space of language in a particular region of the world. And the black dots show what will be left after languages are lost in the next few decades. So understanding linguistic diversity in this much detail unlocks some new opportunities to think about how language systems co-evolve with culture and within ecosystems. And I think this could lead to richer interdisciplinary research. The more we know about language, the more we can say about it and its relationships to other types of information. Finally, I think I've talked a lot about the past and or said depressing things about the future, about losing languages, and that's not great. But I think there's opportunity here. We have learned things through the course of linguistic research about how human languages and culture develop within their ecological context and how language mediates some of these relationships. For example, languages develop systems of terminology for describing the resources and other objects that they encounter in their environments. And these might vary in terms of the processes that shape them or how people talk about different things that they use in their local environment. And so we found, for example, differences between how hunter-gatherer and agriculturalist groups develop terminology systems for things they eat. We've discovered that there are some differences across different sort of categories of use or interaction with human populations in terms of how ethnobiological systems evolve. And I think there's opportunities to better support the maintenance of linguistic and cultural diversity by taking what we know about these systems that link people to places and ecosystems through linguistics to maybe support conservation of cultures, conservation of languages. And hopefully if we use what we know to support those endeavors, that will also help to support biological diversity. Okay, so I've talked to you a lot. And the last thing I want to ask is whether you see any opportunities to interact or whether you have questions about the things you've seen in my kitchen. I really want to thank you for taking the time to connect today. And I hope that if you have ideas or questions or input for interacting more and doing some interesting science, that you feel free to reach out. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Great to see your work as we talked in the summit. Yeah. So yeah, my question is, so you have been here in the summit, EDS Summit, and I guess you remember in the last day we had a discussion about what each word means for different communities.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking here, because we have a challenge there to work in team science with people from different communities.
Yeah.
And do you see any research, maybe anything, any way that we can address this?
Yeah, I actually was thinking about linguistics and the science of team science during the summit, because that, the first day we were talking about team science and the research that's been done to show that team science, how it works and how good collaborations are built. And I think there's absolutely a linguistic component to that that hasn't been studied yet. And so I do think, one of the big hurdles in doing good interdisciplinary research is translating. And translation is a real skill. It's a hard skill to do it well and to convey meaning well across languages. And I think it's the same across other communities, scientific communities. I think there's a huge opportunity for linguistic research within the science of team science. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
There is no like, I don't know, you know all the citations there, so you do not remember anything in the literature that explore the meaning of same words across communities.
So there is, so there's a lot of research about the sort of semantic variability of words. And linking semantics across languages is a big question, big topic. But in the context of sort of collaboration and science, I don't think anybody's looked at that in particular, which is interesting because I present to a lot of different audiences because I work in a weird interdisciplinary space where I'm rarely talking to linguists as my primary audience. And linguists use certain words in different ways, things like frequency in linguistics has a different meaning. We're usually talking about acoustic frequency, right? Or when I'm talking with computational linguists who build those big language models, when I talk about coding data, they think of coding as actually writing code to process information. And so they would call that annotating data. There's a whole bunch of, sort of terminological questions that come up, and every single interdisciplinary interaction has either different uses for words or overlapping uses that aren't a perfect circle Venn diagram. And that's where things get really tricky when people think they're talking about the same thing, but they're not. Yeah. So I think it'd be really cool to look into that more and to try to zero in on some terms that cause problems or kind of create confusion in collaboration and see how people navigate that.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
So excuse me if I misapply the metaphor of biological evolution to linguistic evolution, but thinking about biological evolution, like if you look at like a biodiversity curve through time, right? It's saturated and then big mass extinction events happen. And then all of a sudden we've seen big explosions. And the explanation's been, well, there's the opening up of new niche space as you kind of are recovering after those extinction events. So I guess using that as a metaphor, what do we know about linguistic diversity through time? And what sets up the niche space for
that's a
diversity?
Fantastic question. I don't have an answer for it because it's a really unexplored question, but a great one. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to do more. Yeah. I mean, linguists have only been applying, so back in the early days, right? People were first developing ideas about evolution. They were thinking about language, right? Language is involved in some of those first family tree diagrams that were created to think about evolution. And then linguists and biologists stopped talking to each other for a long time, a couple 100 years at least. And then we finally started talking together, but linguists have been really territorial about linguistic data and applying biological ideas to language, and taking the tools from biology and how we can sort of extend the metaphor and apply it to language. And so it's only really been the last 10 years that there's been a lot of movement forward in this. So we haven't gotten to that question yet, but it's a great one. Thanks. Yeah.
So in our very connected world with a lot of technology and we're Zoom calling all the time, how is that affecting linguistic diversity and like its trajectory?
That's a good question. So one of the sort of tenets of historical linguistics that's pretty well accepted is that contact between people, right, is the way that language features are spread. If I interact with you and I have a particular feature in my speech, you're more likely to adopt that feature if you talk with me than if you've never met me. That's just kind of common sense. We're meeting people that we never would have met, in person, in an era where we were limited to, in my grandmother's era, where, she started out without even a car, right? But eventually she had a car and she could get on an airplane. But nowadays we can connect with people that you couldn't even connect with face-to-face ever, right? And deeper in human history, people would have been limited by technologies in terms of contact. So this has been constantly evolving. And what it's doing is imperiling languages, that more and more the languages that are privileged in digital, communication are becoming more widespread, and little minority languages are becoming less frequently spoken. So that's one big change. There are definitely changes that are happening in terms of speech and how linguistic features travel through communities. There have been, I think about 10 years ago, people started looking at Twitter data, geolocated Twitter data, to see how, sort of new coinages, words that are interesting, are propagated through Twitter, and what sort of geographic signals look like in Twitter, and how that might compare to what we expect when people are talking face to face. So there's definitely changes in how language changes and how we're speaking, and it's a new area of research. There's a lot to be discovered.
Thanks.
We go back to Sibelia's question from the beginning about these problematic words that we found at the summit. So assuming that list will continue to grow, what do you think a good way is to tell the story behind words that is actually useful? So if we say this word came up, here's the story behind it, this is why it was problematic, and then we try to sort of point everybody to that. It feels like that would eventually get like huge and long and big and be different for different people.
I was thinking about this because in the context of the summit, one of the words that got brought up as problematic is the word stakeholder. Stakeholder is a word that, the problem with it is that it evokes this idea of people putting down stakes to claim other people's land. But if you look at the etymology of stakeholder, it comes from betting stakes. So people use pieces of wood to register bets at an earlier point in history, before European people came to North America. And the idea of a stake being associated with a financial holding or some sort of interest, in an idea or a thing or a financial, holding. This happened, that the word split apart, right, from a physical staking land to this sort of placing a bet or having a financial holding somewhere before Europeans colonized North America. But it doesn't mean that word doesn't evoke those feelings for people. So the history doesn't tell the whole story. The etymology of the word, I think it's important to understand, because it might help you understand why people aren't trying to use it in a harmful or hurtful way, but it also doesn't mitigate the feelings that people have, or minimize the pain that people feel when they hear words like that. And so it's a really complex topic with the problematic words, right? With decolonizing our language. It's hard to talk about, because I don't think there's a single, we tell the story and then everybody will understand, right? The perspectives that different people bring to this are so important to what's happening, but I don't know if there's a single story to tell.
Yeah, useful, thank you.
Yeah.
I have another one.
Yeah.
So something you said a second ago made me think of the idea of, again, kind of species mutations versus kind of interspecies mutations, right? So what can we learn about how a given language mutates and evolves? And does that give us any insight into the macro scale diversity of languages we see?
Yeah, good question. I like that question. I don't have an answer. I really think I think that's.
Do people study, for instance, the evolution of new words in a given language? Now they tried to connect that to the diversity of languages that we see.
So, for example, this paper that's very old now, almost a decade old. Some colleagues and I were looking at how people describe, things in the environment. And we found that there are different patterns in how these words evolve. So sometimes you're more likely to inherit it from an ancestor language. Sometimes you're more likely to borrow it from a neighbor. Sometimes you're more likely to have a word and then over time shift its meaning to maybe apply to different things. So for example, in one of the languages I work on, a generic term like fish might come to mean salmon, and then vice versa in another language. So we can identify some of these patterns of shifts. And through this kind of work, we've tried to say, does this generalize to say something like, agricultural or subsistence systems, whether or not you rely on agriculture, can we make inferences from these languages to, sets of languages that might have these associations with, how people interact with the environment in terms of subsistence. What we found is that for most things, there's not really good significant differences here. We can say this generalizes to the hunter-gatherer languages, this generalizes to agriculturalist languages. So this is what I've done that kind of starts to ask that question, but it's a teeny tiny itty bitty baby step. And there's so much more that needs to be done to have a real answer. I don't think anybody's asked that question in quite that way.
Well, thank you so much. Let's give you your hand.